Defense.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Welcome, Senator Brown. Like so many other Americans, I watched with dismay the horror that unfolded in East Palestine, Ohio. On television, we saw a fiery train wreck where nearby residents were understandably fearful that their water was poisoned and their air was polluted. The distress of East Palestine's residents was real then, and it's real now. And Ms. Allison, thank you for being here and testifying today. That's why it's important that we're holding this hearing. This hearing will address two critical topics. First, what can be done to prevent derailments like the one that occurred in East Palestine? Second, what can be done more broadly to improve the safety of trains transporting hazardous materials? While these topics are related, and each topic, I think, merits its own hearing, it appears this morning may be our only opportunity as a full committee to examine the East Palestine derailment and the broader questions about railroad safety policy. To be clear, I agree with Senators Brown and Vance that railroad safety should be on our agenda and that it is an opportunity for real and meaningful bipartisan cooperation. My team and I will continue engaging with their staff and with the chairwoman's staff, and I'm optimistic that we can achieve broad agreement on policies that improve safety, that protect our communities, without at the same time damaging our supply chain or imposing unreasonable costs that would ultimately harm American families. We need to do both. Today, we need to hear what led to the derailment in East Palestine. The NTSB has launched an investigation, and I appreciate Chairwoman Hormandy's appearance here today. This committee is also looking very closely at this derailment. For as much as we know about the derailment, key questions remain unanswered. For example, who specifically made the decision to vent and burn the vinyl chloride from all 5 derailed tank cars? And why? Were alternatives considered? Were the right people consulted? I also want to know what can be done to prevent or to mitigate similar derailments in the future. This committee should hear more about wayside detectors and advanced technologies that could use algorithms and trending analysis to identify potential safety issues earlier. We should hear more about the information available to first responders and about the coordination with shippers of hazardous materials. Understandably, Americans across the country share the concerns of the residents of East Palestine and wonder, are essential hazardous materials being transported safely? Will residents be protected if a spill occurs? Unfortunately, the delayed and disjointed response by the Biden administration has not allayed these concerns. Notably, we heard calls from residents of East Palestine in the local school asking, where is Pete Buttigieg? The response from East Palestine's mayor, Trent Conway, was, quote, I don't know. It took Secretary Buttigieg 10 days to even acknowledge the derailment. After he was called out, he did a 180 and tried to sell a slew of big government regulatory proposals, desperate to disguise the failure of the administration to act sooner. For example, Secretary Buttigieg has proposed reinstating a brake rule that was not supported by cost-benefit analysis. Shortly thereafter, the chairwoman of the NTSB, Chairwoman Hornady, tweeted about this rule. She said, quote, some are saying the ECP, electronically controlled pneumatic brake rule, if implemented, would have prevented this derailment. False. She proceeded to explain that the proposed brake rule would not have applied to the East Palestine train and would not have prevented the derailment even if it had. Undeterred, Secretary Buttigieg then released a laundry list of regulatory proposals, many of which had little to no connection to the East Palestine derailment. In an effort to further distract from his own failed response, Secretary Buttigieg has suggested that President Trump was responsible for the derailment in East Palestine. I know that's a frequent playbook of this administration, blaming every problem on President Trump. But not even the Washington Post fact checker, who usually goes out of his way to back Democrat claims, bought this claim. The Washington Post fact checker concluded, and I quote, "From our analysis, none of the regulatory changes made during the Trump administration at this point can be cited as contributing to the accident." In contrast to Secretary Buttigieg, our colleague on this committee, Senator Vance, has kept his focus where it should be, on the people affected by the derailment. I applaud him and I applaud Senator Brown for focusing on their constituents, and I look forward to continuing to work closely with both of you and with the chairwoman on a bipartisan, serious rail safety package.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. The first panel will provide committee testimony.
Well, Mr. Secretary, welcome. And first of all, I want to thank you for your service. As a former secretary, I understand how difficult your task is, and I appreciate your service. I also understand the responsibility you bear, being responsible for a transportation system and a secure supply chain. I'm sure we both agree that I would say it is in our best interest in national security to have a supply chain that is controlled by U.S. or our allies. I also would ask you to agree that energy independence certainly would be a priority in our national security.
Indeed.
Given that, you also have a record of being an advocate for climate change. I don't think that's changed. Would you? Is that
I wouldn't say I'm
assessment?
for climate change. I'm for fighting it, certainly, yes.
So are you aware then that China is the largest emitter of CO2?
Yes.
And are you aware that China is responsible for 90% of the plastics? 90% of the plastics in the oceans come from 4 rivers in China. Are you aware of that?
I didn't know that statistic, but I'm not surprised by it.
Well, are you aware also that China is the largest violator of fishing regulations and laws?
Yes.
And of course, you're also aware of critical minerals.
Yes.
Are you aware that China controls, either directly or indirectly, more than 62%? In many cases, the preponderance or absolute control of critical minerals.
A condition we are working hard to change in this administration.
And I'm going to ask you further about that. But critical minerals, as you know, is also required for EV.
Indeed.
Seems to be that cobalt, lithium, in some cases germanium, is absolutely required for EV. And are you aware that to meet the demands today, that the U.S. would have to increase mining by 2,000% for 20 years to reach the demands today?
Well, the chemistry of our batteries has not completely stabilized in a way that I think can be fully predicted for the next
There
decade,
may be
but
innovation.
there's no question that we're going to
right now.
Yeah, there's no question that we're going to need to
no
source
question.
more minerals, both domestically and from friendly countries.
Well, and that's the catch, is we all want cleaner, better, more efficient. But your stated goal and President Biden's stated goal and my stated goal, and certainly President Trump's was the same, is that we seek energy independence. We seek energy dominance so we're not held hostage by foreign entities.
Indeed.
So how do you get to be energy independent when the components of EV today are all controlled by China? And have you done an assessment of how much mining we would have to do and where the critical minerals are and what we'd have to do in order to meet the demands of a very aggressive program to convert? And have you done an assessment?
Yes, thanks for the question. While some of the finer points related to extraction are probably better answered by my colleagues at the Department of the Interior, our Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which is jointly run by both us and the
And what does the
Department of
assessment
Energy,
say since you've completed it?
Well, what that work is doing is identifying different points, not just in the raw material extraction itself, but also in the refining, where we see that if we were to...
But have you identified where our sticking points is?
Right, so a lot of the...
How to get there in 10 years? Because it seems like on the supply chain, if China controls it today, and we're putting moratorium on mines in Minnesota that have the largest nickel deposit in critical minerals, and we're not moving forward on securing the supply chain, but we're moving forward on solar cells.
Well, again, the Department of
Solar
Energy,
cells made in China. So
be much easier to answer
So how are you
your
going to
question
figure
if
this
not.
out?
Okay. So part of what you're describing is the motivation behind the investments that the Department of Energy has been leading in enhancing U.S.
Well,
domestic.
I agree. There's effort, but have you identified source? Because there's a difference between practical, real, and fiction.
Well,
So
I know
how are
that
you going to be independent if China produces the very components that make up EV?
this is exactly why we're doing the work to produce them here in the United States. I wish you could-
What are we doing on cobalt? How much cobalt are we producing in this country? In the next 10 years, what do we need? And how are we going? I'm a military guy. I love plans.
Great.
You know I do.
Well, first of all, I'd encourage you to become familiar with the private investment and the public-private partnership investment, real dollars, not just plans, that are going out through these DOE
Have you read the
programs.
critical mineral report, the multi-agency report 2017?
I have not read the 2017 multi-agency critical mineral report.
I am very familiar.
I'm sure you are.
Absolutely familiar. Have you read the 2017 climate change report, multi-agency?
I believe that's informed some of the work that is in
you
our
read it?
plans through the joint energy, but I've not read that document cover to cover, no.
I would suggest that, Mr. Secretary, that you read those two documents.
Well, I can,
On both cases, what they clearly state is the U.S. is becoming dependent on China.
which is,
And unless we change the rudder, is that we will be more dependent. And unless we figure out the supply chain first, our pursuit of EV makes us more dependent on China.
I would
For
argue
solar
that our action to win the EV future cannot wait. I would argue that China is already working to win EVs and that they will win if
Well,
we
Mr.
do not
Secretary,
pursue this.
if it requires critical minerals and we don't have control of them, and China manufactures, produces, processes the very components necessary for EV, then how is that achievable to be independent if we depend on China more? And the more we press, and I'm all for the above, all the above. But before we leap blindly, there's two concerns. One is that we have clear control, either ourselves or our allies, of the supply chain, to include the critical minerals and components. Secondly is, what are we going to do when they're end of life cycle? As you know, 90%, or are you aware that 90% of the solar cells today are dumped in some landfill across the country?
I'm not as familiar with the life cycle of solar cells, but I would emphasize one of the most important things to bear in mind when we think about the critical mineral sourcing and refining that goes into EV battery components is that end-of-life recycling will be a vital part of how we meet our marks. Now, of course, that's alongside the onshoring and friendshoring that we need to do, both with regard to the extraction.
Unfortunately, we're going to take a
and refinement.
recess, but the concerns, I'll end it with this, is the concerns I have are supply chain, from the very beginning to the very end. What are we going to do, and does that make us more vulnerable to a potential adversary? So with that, since there's only one member and promotion by attrition, we'll have to take a quick recess, and sir, thank you for being here, and I appreciate all you do.
Thank you, Congressman.
Secretary, thank you for being here today. Really quickly, your department oversees the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which I'm sure you're aware recently proposed the CAFE standards for 27 to 32. You're also likely aware that the EPA agency has separately proposed overlapping greenhouse gas standards. Sir, can you explain what actions you've taken to coordinate with the EPA Administrator Reagan to ensure that auto manufacturers that comply with greenhouse gas regulations are also compliant with fuel economy standards issued by DOT?
Thanks for the question. We recognize that the development of two related but different sets of standards, one from NHTSA with regard to fuel economy, one from EPA with regard to emissions, can be a complicated thing for industry to deal with if we're not as transparent and coordinated as possible and as appropriate, while of course recognizing we're still separate agencies. And so we have worked to the extent appropriate in coordination with EPA and with the White House.
All right, well, I'll get more specific. Specific to the DOT, CAFE standards in model year 2732 indicate automakers will pay $10 to $13 billion in civil penalties for noncompliance. Mr. Secretary, will these penalties increase or decrease the vehicle cost for the average American buyer?
Well, if there's a failure to comply and there's a penalty assessed and the automaker puts that penalty on the back of the consumer, then their costs will increase. On the other hand, the consumer will be saving money thanks to the reduced gas that they'll be buying thanks to the standards. And we estimate saving about $1,000 per
Okay, so
consumer through
let's
these standards.
assume that we go forward. Are those penalties reinvested by DOT in programs that would actually support more efficient vehicles, pollution reduction, or workforce development? Or do they go to the general fund as essentially an implicit tax on the American people, which is the role of Congress?
I'm not in a position to speak to the use of penalty funding that hasn't been collected yet, but certainly think that partnering with Congress, it could be appropriate to make sure it gets assigned in ways that further the policy goal, provided they don't amount to undercutting the purpose of the penalty in the first place, which is to get the automaker to do the right thing and comply so that there's no penalty at all.
Would another right thing be profit sharing with UAW?
Say again?
Would another right thing be profit sharing with the UAW?
We certainly think that auto workers ought to get their fair share of the growth and the
So you agree that profit sharing with UAW is something that is proper. These
Well,
penalties...
just to be clear,
with these
I'm not at the negotiating table, and I'm not going to...
neither of us are, but both of us,
But,
I'm here to
certainly we
protect
stand with
my
UAW's
workers here.
efforts to make sure
So with the president's unrealistic projection for electric vehicle sales in the future, 67% by year 2032, affecting the profitability of these plants is going to take dollars away from auto workers. The approximate formula is about $1,000 per auto worker for $1 billion for the automakers. If penalties are levied on the automakers, then this will take money away from the auto workers. Is the president aware that he's literally taking money away from UAW workers by impugning their bonuses?
I just don't think that's the right characterization because it assumes that the auto workers will fail to comply with the law. The automakers will fail to comply with the law. Look, ever since the first CAFE standards were introduced in the Nixon administration, industry said, there's no way we could possibly have vehicles more efficient than 13.5 miles a gallon. There's been a push-pull to make sure that we have the maximum feasible. But in the end, industry got it done. And today, American consumers have saved billions and billions of dollars. And of course, we have cleaner air because of these standards. And I have a lot of confidence that industry can continue, as they have done in the past.
I have a lot of confidence in the
comply with the
industry
law.
as well, but requiring going from 67%, and you mentioned earlier tripling, but that tripling is up to 7% now, and requiring that in just a handful of years goes beyond aggressive and goes into the area of dangerous. Look, I really appreciate you bringing up Penelope Rose and Joseph August. I have my little boys, and we have a hybrid electric vehicle that we plug in as well. But there's a housing crisis throughout America with affordability, and right now, this is not only going to affect the automotive industry, it's going to affect average, everyday Americans. Based upon the president's unrealistic projection, can you explain what's being done in apartment complexes for Americans, whether it be folks suffering from a housing crisis in northern Michigan or in my district, in the southern portion of my district, making vehicle charging convenient at a reasonable cost for people already paying rent that's high? What do you think is acceptable? And what's the DOT doing to help make this charging more affordable?
Thanks. It's an excellent question, and it's one of the reasons why we have the community fueling infrastructure funding alongside or as part of the NEVI program. We recognize that especially, look, if you have a single-family home, you already have charging infrastructure. You can plug, if you have a garage, you can plug in there. But if you're in a multifamily dwelling, as many low-income Americans are, you can't assume that you're going to have that kind of charging infrastructure. And you also can't assume that it is yet profitable for a company to put it in. That is exactly why we're applying the funds that were provided by Congress to make sure that in these areas where it just doesn't yet pencil out for a company to do it, that we're buying down that difference so that some of the very Americans who would most benefit in terms of their family budget from the savings that come with filling up with electricity instead of gas can actually access it through affordable and convenient chargers.
One last thing, Mr. Secretary. Seeing the electric vehicles don't pay a corresponding user fee for the Highway Trust Fund, such as the 18.4 cents per gallon for gasoline. How does the CAFE reduce collections in the trust fund? I don't believe there's anything in the DOT's proposed rulemaking explaining what the high rate of electrification will mean for improvements to our nation's roads and bridges. Effectively, this rising debt of the federal government will put increased pressure on Congress and this committee to fund infrastructure improvements through the general fund, and that seems to be a major omission in the administration being honest about ensuring our nation's roads and bridges don't deteriorate further due to the higher CAFE and greenhouse gas requirements, and further pushing the cost of this EV transition onto folks who are least able to afford it. Can you comment on how we can maintain our infrastructure with the increased weight and decreased funding for our infrastructure?
Sure, and again, ever since CAFE standards began in the Nixon administration, improving the average efficiency of a car past 13.5 miles per gallon, there has been the effect, alongside all of the money that it saves drivers and car owners, that it also means that because Americans are paying less for gas, they're paying less gas tax. We think Americans paying less for gas is a good thing. We think Americans paying less gas tax because they're getting more efficient vehicles is a good thing. But we recognize that that means there have to be alternative ways to support the Highway Trust Fund. Historically, Congress has filled that gap through general dollars. That's not the only way to do it, but it's certainly a legitimate way to do it, and it's what has been happening ever since that gap first opened up.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My time has expired, and Chairman now recognizes Mr. Moulton.
I'll call on Mr. Crawford, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'm curious about the funding tables that was provided by your staff to our committee. It's 6 pages of spreadsheets here. I don't know if you've seen those or not, but they present a very incomplete funding picture, as they only capture advanced funding from IJA and some supplemental funding from FY22 and FY23. Besides that, we continue to hear the administration touting how much money is being invested in infrastructure. These tables actually indicate something different. You've obligated less than 30% of the total funding for the Federal Transit Administration. In fact, you've only outlaid 9.7% of that funding. Less than 3% of the money for the Federal Railroad Administration has been outlaid. Only 35% of the FY22 money for federal aid highways has been obligated, and only 11% has been outlaid. So we continue to hear about the need for more money for infrastructure investment, but it seems that you're not spending the money you have already. What's going on here?
Well, I don't have the charts that you're describing at my fingertips, but I would refer you to the lifespan of a project. So between the time the project is identified for funding, when the project sponsor is ready to execute the grant agreement, when the spending takes place, and then when the obligation and/or reimbursement take place. That is something that doesn't always happen within 1 or even 2 calendar years. Now, for our part, we want to do everything we can to make sure that any part of that timeline that's under our control is swift. But of course, that also depends largely on the readiness of project sponsors. So there is often a lag, 1, 2, 3, sometimes more years, between when funding is appropriated and authorized and when those dollars had been assigned to a project. But again,
yes, but in the interim, the obligation of those funds, which we're also seeing a significant amount of funds that aren't obligated, let alone outlaid. So I understand the time lag, and I get that completely based on the timeline for appropriations versus the money actually being there. But I guess my question is, you know, if you can explain all this taxpayer money that's sitting in your agency's bank account instead of being used where it should be, obligated, not necessarily outlaid, but at least obligated to maintain pace with the kind of projects that you talked about in your opening statement.
Yeah, and again, I would describe in terms of the pipeline of funding that moves through and the lag that's associated with that. So nobody's sitting around, and neither are the dollars. But the gap between the fiscal year in which it's authorized or appropriated and the moment when that construction takes place, that's very real. And of course, it depends on the project, right? We can get something out through formula dollars often more quickly than a complicated project that involves perhaps multiple modal administrations or multiple project sponsors working across state lines. But you have my commitment that anything that's under our department's control, we are going to move as swiftly as possible. I would not infer that the fact that it takes some time to spend those dollars is an argument for doing less in the future to improve our physical infrastructure.
Well, I think you missed the point of my question. So a lot of the times we hear from, for example, municipalities or county governments or state governments that say we could do a lot more with our money if we got it in a timely fashion. For example, the obligation of the funds can start things moving if the funds aren't obligated. And as I indicated in these percentages, we're well into to IJA, for example. And we still have a significant amount of money that hasn't even been obligated, let alone outlaid. So, I hope you'll consider that, because the feedback that we get from home all the time is, where's the money? And it appears that you have quite a bit of it in your account based on the spreadsheets that your staff's provided for us. But let me move on to something else. The Federal Highway Administration announced a notice of proposed rulemaking to require states and MPOs to establish a new performance measure with declining targets for carbon dioxide and to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation under the Federal Aid Highways Program. This was done despite the department having no authority to impose such a requirement. In fact, a greenhouse gas performance measure requirement was specifically omitted from IJA. How can you claim that imposing a GHG performance measure is consistent with the law or the intent of Congress, given that it was considered and specifically excluded from IJA?
Because under the law as written, we have the authority to implement performance measures. And just because Congress did not require it of us does not mean that we're not able to do it. Now, we believe this is consistent with other instances in which Federal Highway Administration or other operating administrations have developed performance measures, whether on safety or other domains. And I want to emphasize that this is not a mandate. It doesn't set a target for states. We're simply requiring that there be some kind of measurement of the performance of something that relates to the impact of how the federal taxpayer dollars we're sending.
I would argue that the
affect
states
people who live in
perceive
those
that as a
states.
mandate based on your implementation of that, and what other action are they supposed to take? I mean, given the fact that you don't have the authority and yet you're continuing to leverage that and put that on the states. My time is expired, so I yield back.
Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Secretary. I represent northeastern Minnesota, Minnesota's 8th Congressional District. A couple questions. What is the average, do you know the average temperature in a Minnesota winter?
I know it's pretty cold, but I wouldn't know
Well,
the
it's 12 degrees, although some of my constituents saw temperatures as cold as 42 below last year. Mr. Secretary, how many states have an average winter temperature of below freezing? It's half the country. Does cold weather affect an EV's battery life? Yes or no?
Yes, it does.
How much can an EV battery life be reduced by cold weather?
Depends on the chemistry of the battery and the model that you're in, but it's a substantial percentage of the EV battery life.
50% or more. And how long does it take for frostbite to kick in if an individual is out in the cold? Let's say their EV has run out of battery on northbound 35 between Minneapolis and Duluth.
You know, I once got stuck on northbound 35.
About
and
30,
I know it
about
doesn't
30
take very
minutes. It's about 30 minutes before frostbite. Mr. Secretary, do you know the average income household in the district that I represent? You probably don't, so I'll tell you. It's $69,000. Do you know what the average price of an EV vehicle is?
Sure, I pulled the latest numbers. The models are starting around $30,000 for sedans. They're getting into the 40s for
According to Kelley Blue Book, the average price for electric cars was over $53,000.
Surely you're
last
aware that
July.
they start closer to 30, right?
My constituents would have to work a full year to pay for this unreliable car and would barely have enough left over to care for their family. What is the average median income of a single individual EV buyer? It's $150,000.
As of when?
It's $150,000
As of when? I'm just asking because that number is going down each passing year.
this month. This month. And how much of a taxpayer-funded subsidy is given to those high-income earners to purchase their EV?
As you may recall, the
should
Inflation
know this.
Reduction Act was set in such a way that there was an income cap on how you could benefit from it, so that the wealthiest
$7,500.
people are not able to take advantage of that. But we do wish we had your
Mr.
support
Secretary,
in lowering the cost of EVs.
Mr. Secretary, would you agree it's $7,500?
Say again?
Would you agree it's $7,500?
$7,500 is the maximum credit that is eligible, and we think that making
For
EVs
the
cheaper
elites
for
to buy
working
their
families
electric
to the
vehicle.
tune of
It's my-
$7,500
Mr.
is a good
Secretary,
move.
excuse me. Do you think that it's fair for your administration to force constituents to purchase these electric vehicles when they're not working, especially in northern Minnesota?
Well, the premise of the question is false because we're not forcing anybody to purchase any technology. Can you refer to any particular policy that forces anybody to
by
purchase any vehicle?
2035, you want 2/3 of Americans to be using electric vehicles. They don't work in northern Minnesota in the cold weather today. And I want to just share something with you. Mr. Garamendi, and I agree with him, buy American. Last July, you sat in that same spot and answered our questions. And I told you about a concern that I have with child slave labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I told you that we could mine these critical minerals needed for EVs in the district that I represent under the best labor and environmental standards in the world. But you and the administration went ahead with an MOU with the DRC in January of this year well-documented child slave labor in the DRC, hardly any environmental standards. And your administration chose to enter MOUs with the Congo, where 15 of the 19 mines are owned by the communist country of China, where they use slave laborers. It's unbelievable that you chose other workers over the American worker. And it's unbelievable that you won't allow you and your administration won't allow mining here in Minnesota and the United States. Your Secretary of Energy, Secretary Granholm, came to the Western Caucus, and I happened to ask her, I said, do you know the only nickel mine in the United States today? She couldn't answer that. Do you know where it is?
No, I don't.
It's in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the Eagle Mine. It's the gold standard. And she's our energy secretary. And do we need nickel, cobalt, and copper for these electric vehicles as we transition? The answer is yes. We need to mine here in America with American miners, American labor. We can do it. The biggest copper nickel find in the world, and your administration just banned it. Union labor, Mr. Secretary, that we want. In your administration took the union labor off mining. And not only in northeastern Minnesota, but across this country, because today, this administration, they cannot give one example of allowing a mine to be opened in this country. And I yield back.
Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Secretary, welcome. Just a couple questions. I'm trying to get to some points here. As mayor of South Bend, did you have operational oversight over the airport?
No, that was a county body.
County project. And as your tenured mayor, were there major highway projects either initiated or completed during your tenure there?
Yeah, probably the biggest was the effort that we did with the highway pair that goes through the heart of our city. It was
That's
Michigan
I-90?
Street and Main Street. Say again?
Is that I-90?
No, it was originally US 31. We got a relinquishment from the state to get it done. Proud to say we got an award from the US DOT
What was the
on that
approximate
work.
budget of that? Do you recall? Just
The
approximate.
particular project that we're doing on the streetscape, that's about a $25 million project.
Streetscape, okay, 25 million, thank you. I understand that in South Bend that you wanted to construct a new train station downtown. How did that go?
Well, we didn't initiate a project to build a train station downtown, but certainly something that I believed as mayor could benefit the city, and still hope someday that that could become a reality. In order for it to become a reality, there'd have to be cooperation from the freight railroads that have a lot of the right-of-way that goes into it, and a level of funding that, at least on my watch, was not present at the city level. But I'm hopeful that, obviously, there's new leadership in South Bend doing a great job. But I'm hopeful that one way or another they can enhance rail connectivity, because I think it'd really benefit the community.
Yeah, I did read about the South Shore line there at the airport and the Amtrak station somewhere in the Netherlands between downtown. I draw on that experience to think about the transit budget that you managed in South Bend of, I guess CNN reported as $10 million and 47 buses, to $90 billion approximately for your department today. Given this experience and having demonstrated a superior work ethic, I was going to ask that you draw attention in your $90 billion budget to properly staff the New York Terminal Radar Approach Control. Currently, it's at 54% staffing. You may know that this causes a lot of delays on the East Coast in and out, particularly of the New York City core airports, the main three. And it disrupts air travel. What are you doing to approach that? 54% seems quite dangerous.
Well, it's not dangerous in terms of safety, but I agree that it's unacceptable. While we always make sure that there is adequate staffing to safely manage flight operations, when you're at 54%, what happens is that you have far more overtime going on. And in the worst case, if there were some perceived or potential risk to safety, it could even lead to ATC staffing-driven flow measures that could impact cancellations and delays. Now, let me be very clear.
Are there safety measures for overworking our air traffic controllers? Because
absolutely, yeah, of course, there are
4%
fatigue
sounds almost like everybody's working double shifts.
The fatigue requirements are always met at N90 or any other facility. But look, I think we're actually largely on the same page here. And so the thing I would want to it'd be really helpful if
I would
could answer.
emphasize just when you say that it's not dangerous, is that because flights are being canceled in and out of the New York corridor?
This is the thing I want.
because
Yeah,
of
this is the thing I
staffing?
want to
So,
emphasize, right? If I'd love to be able to answer.
Inconvenience or, yeah, please.
Would love to be able to answer your question.
Sure.
If a staffing level reaches the point where you can't safely guide the number of flights that are programmed, since compromising safety is not an option, the only alternative is that flights could be disrupted or delayed.
No, the alternative actually is that we have leadership that fulfills its responsibility of manning the operations of our air
Of course,
traffic
we're on the
control.
same page
So
here. What I'm saying
I don't
is
think
that
we are, because
I think we are.
your department is have a significant shortfall, and you don't seem to be bothered by it. So
I've made very clear how bothered I am
canceling
by it. And
flights-
let me tell you, the number one thing that
flights
would help
actually
us
doesn't seem
prevent
to
that.
be a reasonable response. You know, there's more to this.
Sorry, are you suggesting that we
there's-
compromise safety instead of
No, it's
disruption?
not whatsoever. In fact, as
So
a
do you
nuclear engineer, I actually know a lot about safety, and probably a lot more than you. So what I'm suggesting is that you have a responsibility with a $90 billion budget to administer it. I realize that's a stretch from a $10 million budget of your experience. Having demonstrated
That's
what I
an
would
inaccurate
say-
statement. Congressman,
what I
look,
would
when you come
say
from where I
is,
come from,
what
you're
I would
accustomed
say
to
is that-
people from, may I?
I know a lot of people from a lot of places. So
May I?
when I see,
Am I going to get to answer your question or not?
I think you've dodged the question sufficiently. Thank you.
Gentlemen,
The chair now recognizes Mr. Burleson for 5 minutes.
Secretary Buttigieg, since taking the role, you've traveled quite a bit, including private flights. How often do you take private flights?
So I assume by private flights you mean the use of government aircraft assigned to my agency. And I knew this might come up, so I brought some numbers. Since getting this job, I have taken 600, these are estimates, give or take a couple, but I've taken 638 flights.
And any of those commercial?
Say about
Any
that?
of those commercial?
607 of them were commercial, 10 of them were on military aircraft such as Air Force One, and 21 of them were on FAA aircraft, representing about 3% of the flights.
What was there was a Freedom of Information request made of your office to reveal the costs of the travel. Have you provided those costs?
I'd have to check back with the office to see how on the traffic, but I can tell you that, yeah, we're going to comply
As I
with
understand,
all
it's
FOIA
been months
requests.
and you've not provided the financial numbers for that travel.
Okay, again, I can check on the status of a FOIA request, but I can also...
You'll commit to providing that information? the
We
expenses?
will always comply with FOIA. But I appreciate the chance to discuss this because I can't help but get the sense that some people want to make it sound as if I
Yeah,
don't
Mr.
travel most of
Secretary.
the time on commercial aircraft, which of course is untrue.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, I think the irony for most people in my district is that they're being told that they're going to have to convert to electric vehicles to reduce their carbon footprint, and yet not everyone gets to travel the way that you do. And
Just
so,
once again, the way I usually travel is in economy class aboard an airliner like everybody else. When we do it differently, it's often because it will save taxpayer money.
I want to get on.
I'm so
to
glad you
some
asked this because
items.
I'm kind of excited
Mr.
to share some of the
Secretary
details
Buttigieg,
and put some
I want to
to it.
ask, you've got some interesting policies since you've taken office. Some of them include that you spent $1 billion to fight against racist highways, which is befuddling to me. You are forcing training manuals that divide Americans. You have climate policies that appease the radical environmentalists. You renamed the NOTAM system to be a gender neutral. And yet, at the same time, while that's happening, those are your efforts, you have a failure of the NOTAM system, which has not been updated under your leadership. You had the East Palestine event that occurred, which took you nearly 3 weeks to show up for. And the American citizen is currently facing countless flight delays. Just ask them. And yet we have still supply chain issues. So my question is, why are you pushing those policies when we have nuts and bolts issues to deal with?
Well, if we want to talk nuts and bolts issues, let's talk about the investments we're making to improve port infrastructure, for example, that's helped with supply chain issues. Let's talk about the fact that during the same season in which many critics said that Christmas would be canceled because of supply chain issues, we worked with ports, with the private sector and the public sector and workers to see to it that by the end of that year, there was an all-time record high in retail sales and good movements through our ports. Now, talk nuts and bolts issues. Let's talk about the 37,000 physical infrastructure projects so far and counting, supported through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And since you raised East Palestine,
Secretary,
I hope that's an indication that we
yeah.
can get you on the record in favor of the Railway Safety Act.
Secretary, about railway safety, it's an interesting, when you look at the trends, according to data from the Federal Railroad Administration, the numbers since 2000 have dramatically improved. Mainline Class 1 railroads, their accident rate is down 48% since 2000. You have derailments that are down 31% since 2000. You have even hazmat issues. They're down 73% since 2000. All across the board, safety has improved, and yet starkly over the last couple of years, according to the FRA data, it shows that even though we did have a trend since 2000 of reductions, these accidents did have an increase under your watch of 13% compared to the previous year. How do you account for that?
Well, actually, so far, the rate of derailments this year is down compared to last year, but I do appreciate you being perhaps the first Republican congressman to acknowledge that overall rail accidents on my watch are substantially down from what they were 10 or 20 years ago. Now, the question, in my view, is how to get them down even further, which is why I would love to have you stand with us and not with the rail lobby on the Railway Safety Act.
If you care about safety, why did you turn down BNSF's ability to use drone technology to check the rails?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. One thing that really frustrates me is the characterization that we deny the ability to use drones to inspect rails. That's not true. What's true is that we require that it be supplemented by the traditional human inspection until that technology is proven out. We are not stopping them for 1 second from using these new technologies.
Arbitrary and capricious by a court.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Secretary, thank you for coming. Thanks for listening to our questions. I want to pick up where we left off in July of 2022 regarding what I view as the administration's anti-market policies in regard to EVs. They are expensive. The grid is not, we're building a second grid, I guess, on top of the grid we already have, which is a huge cost, and people are paying for that in their electric bills. The batteries have limited range, and despite the subsidization, the market is literally not adopting EVs, regardless of what we want to believe or what you want to say. There's significant inflationary pressures and a glut of electric vehicles, well beyond demand. And so if we consider the current UAW strike, the cost of living has eaten away at these folks' ability to pay their grocery bill and their gas bill. So they're obviously and righteously and rightfully upset. And the administration's subsidization of the electric vehicles is killing their jobs. They know this. On the second point related to EVs, I think it's important to quote the UAW president, Shawn Fain, directly, and I quote, "Not only is the federal government not using its power to turn the tide, they're actively funding a race to the bottom with billions in public money," unquote. Now, you've recently moved to Michigan, I understand it, and I just wonder what you have to say to Michiganders who feel the federal government is using their very tax dollars to destroy their industry and their jobs.
Well, one of two things is going to happen, Representative. Either the EV revolution is going to be made in China or it's going to be made in America.
But right now it's destroying their jobs.
Is that we are working to make sure that it's made in America.
And it's being subsidized, which is destroying their jobs. So is your position that we're going to lose all these jobs? That's what has to happen
or China's going to build all these vehicles. Is that the position?
One of the reasons we've seen manufacturing jobs grow so much in this administration compared to the manufacturing recession under the last administration is that we're investing in American manufacturing.
You're
and adding
investing
these
with
companies.
our money in things that we don't want. You realize that forcing car companies to make these vehicles at a loss, about $60,000 per vehicle sold, is damaging to the UAW's jobs. In fact, I'm going to just look at Ford. I hate to call them out, but their electric vehicle unit is expected to lose $4.5 billion this year, which is up from $2.1 billion in losses last year. There's a 92-day supply of electric vehicles, which is twice that of the current average of the internal combustion or traditional car. And I would just remind everybody that electric vehicles were one of the first vehicles on the market back in the early 1900s, but they were replaced by better technology then. Now, the average new vehicle transaction price is about, I don't know, I just heard one of my colleagues, $50,000. I got $48,763, which is up $10,000 since your boss became the president, and the average used vehicle price is $26,510. Mr. Secretary, the people I work for, my bosses, can't afford what you're forcing on them. These are not market forces. This is the government funding the destruction of our own automotive industry. And I hope you know that approximately 2/3 of EV owners make over $100,000 a year. My bosses don't make that. I don't know if you can justify or how you justify forcing my constituents to pay for EVs and EV infrastructure for coastal elites and wealthy people, but somehow you do.
Well, I need to point out that wealthy people were specifically excluded from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well,
We
I
wish
just
we could have
gave
had
you the
your
number.
support on
Do you
cutting the cost
dispute
of
that
these.
2/3 of EV owners are owned by people over 100,000 that make over 100,000? Do you
Sure, because
dispute that?
the first EVs, of course, were
Do you
acquired by
dispute
more-
that?
No, but that number's going down.
Those are the facts. It doesn't matter if they're going down now.
why were you
The folks
against
that
cutting
I
the price of
represent
EVs?
can't afford them today, sir.
Why were you against cutting their costs?
All these factors. I'm not against cutting their costs. The market should do it. But you want the government, you want my taxpayers to pay to cut the cost, which isn't cutting the cost.
If you were of the
it's
view,
subsidizing the cost.
respectfully, Congressman,
Sir,
if you were of
with
the
all
view
these
that there should be
factors
no
combined,
subsidy to propulsion
all these
vehicles, then are
factors
you against
combined
oil and gas
mean
subsidies?
that for
Do you
every
believe that oil
EV
and gas
sold, sir,
subsidies
at a loss, that the cost of the, as my colleague on the other side, the gas-guzzling pickup truck is higher now to pay for the loss as you kill your administration, and you in particular, kill the auto industry. And I'll remind you, in 2008, after the financial crisis, the federal government bailed out this industry. So while you're here today, will you commit and will you pledge to oppose any effort to bail out the auto industry after you force it into bankruptcy again? Will you do that today, sir?
Congressman, I got started in politics when
I guess the answer is
the
no. I
Indiana
yield the
factory was at risk of being shut down because an elected official in my state tried to block the administration from saving Chrysler. I got involved and stood with the UAW to save those jobs, and I'll always be with auto jobs being preserved.
I
Yield back.
Mr. Nels. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary. You have $66 billion, 66 with a B, for rail and IIJA. That's a lot of money at your department's discretion. The California high-speed rail project started 15 years ago. Big promises in that project. It was supposed to be the next best thing in transportation in America. And for the record, I just want to let you know and everybody know that I support high-speed rail in America. I just don't support this project. And here's why. I have a document here. It's the California High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group letter from March 23rd, 2023. And I'd like to submit it for the record. Are you familiar with this document, sir?
I can't recognize
That's okay.
it at a
I'll make
distance,
sure you
but I'm
get
aware
one.
that there's been
Fair
a lot
enough.
of reporting. Yeah.
This document is nothing more than, it's an SOS warning to cancel the California high-speed rail project because it's riddled with billions in cost overruns. The numbers in this document almost make it seem criminal. And I'm going to quote directly from the letter written to the board members. This group was created by Proposition 1A and is required to report to the state legislature in California on the California High-Speed Rail Authority. In this document, the peer review group says, since 2008, a consistent theme emerges. Project costs, schedules, and ridership estimates are uncertain and subject to significant risk of deteriorating. The project is underfunded and its financing is unstable, rising costs and making effective management difficult, if not impossible. Most importantly, more legislative oversight is needed. In the peer review 2023 project update report, it states that project costs continue to rise with no clear end in sight. The current contract values are 97%, Mr. Secretary, higher than the original award values. Phase 1 grew from $68 billion in 2012 to $92 billion in 2022, and now projected to be $106 billion in 2023. The scheduling on the costs, it says a construction project was awarded in August of 2013, and it was to be completed in 2018. This is before COVID. Don't use COVID as an excuse. And now they say the current completion is December of 2026. Ridership, big idea, 2009, big business plan, 41 million people. Now you know what they project for 2023? Down to 31 million people. Why do they have 10 million less? I don't know. But the report, and you need to get this, sir, because you need to see it. The report recommends that the legislature may want to request the selection and appointment of the Inspector General be given high priority. This project needs to be looked at. This is billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. It's my understanding now they want $3 billion more from the federal city intercity passenger grant program. And I want to make sure, sir, that we're not throwing good money after bad. The letter highlights that even if the project gets $8 billion, they will still be short of at least another $2.5 billion, even after the state of California funds are included. Have you visited the project, sir?
I haven't been to the construction.
Oh, you got to get there. You got to get there, sir. This is billions and billions of dollars. Are you willing to invest more taxpayer dollars on this project, which seems highly unlikely to succeed, versus sending that limited money elsewhere?
Well, I want to take care, let me start with where we agree, which is support for high-speed rail in general, and supporting high-speed rail in general
I'm with
doesn't
you.
necessarily mean that one would support a particular project. Because this particular project is in active application for some processes that are underway, I want to be careful not to prejudice that process.
And listen, I appreciate you, sir, and I think this is what we should do. I think we should work together, you and I, conduct a full audit of the project before any high-speed grant decisions are made. Maybe you can call me up one day, we get on that jet, and we go fly out there and take a good look at it. How's that? You want to go look at that? Because I'm telling you, this gives high-speed rail a bad look. It's just costing billions of dollars, and they're going to come to your office, and they're going to request more. I got to move into something else because I have 29 seconds. Do we have a pilot shortage, my friend?
Pilot availability is certainly...
We do have a pilot shortage. I fly around a lot of time. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Do you believe that at a certain age that people should be forced to retire, this arbitrary age of 65? You think that's fair, that's right?
Yes.
You do. How about having people in the highest office in our nation over 80?
I think most of us can agree
I'm just
that
asking you a
certain
question.
professions like flying an
Should we be
aircraft
forced to
are
retire as a
different,
president of the
and,
United States at 80?
You know, I think there are a lot of folks here who could do a great job regardless of their age, but I
Let's
wouldn't
keep our
necessarily want them
experienced
flying by
pilots
airplane.
in the air, sir. Let's keep them in the air. With that, I yield back.
Now, as a gentleman from California, Representative Lamalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, welcome to our committee lair. Glad to have you here today. So we've covered a lot of interesting topics so far. High-speed rail in California, that's always a fun one for me since I've watched that evolve for a long time as a Californian, and still the fact remains that the price of the thing has quadrupled from what the taxpayers originally sold when they approved about $10 billion worth of bonds, and the ARA Act in about 2009 supplemented with about $3.5 billion more when all the other states threw theirs back in the pot and California got it all. We've only been able to supplement that with some CO2 auctions at the state level. So we're going to be probably 70, 80, 90 billion dollars short to complete that project. So however much begging they come with hat in hand to this Congress here, to DC, that's what they're going to be ultimately asking for, because it'll never pay for itself. So it's time to move on to something else. I was found it interesting here earlier on the price of electric vehicles that an F-150 is $50,000 now because it's about $10,000 higher it should be because of supply chain and a COVID shutdown that was much longer than it should have been. So you can see an F-150 at 50 grand, but you can see the Lightning version up to all electric is about 70 to 80 grand. You can look that right up. So EV vehicles are going to be much costlier than the same equivalent, same size of a internal combustion vehicle. So that's a reality that consumers are going to face as they get pushed out of having the choices. Is what Mr. Perry was saying. Ford is losing their rear end on these things right now, and that's going to have to affect the price of everything else as well as the jobs. So the thing that it comes down to is that we're going to have to make them here, we're going to let China make them. Well, even China making them is something that people aren't asking for unless they have a free choice. So what I want to get at, Mr. Secretary, first, why are we doing all this? Is it high-speed rail is because we're chasing a few tons of CO2? All these electric vehicles is it because we're chasing CO2? Is that really the whole deal?
Here's the way I look at it. The EV revolution is happening with or without us. Exercising their free choice, Americans have tripled the proportion of cars that they are purchasing electric already, and we're still at the very outset of this revolution. You add to the fact that the cost of producing the cars will come down, and that if you've ever driven one, you probably know that it has superior performance, lower maintenance costs, lower cost of fueling it.
Not in my rural
and
district,
fewer
sir,
moving
because
parts.
I have to drive many, many miles, and I can't, people don't want to come to my district so much because they can't count on being able to charge their vehicle if they want to go way up to Modoc County or something. So
Yeah, for sure. If you're driving more than a couple hundred miles a day, then you really depend on that charging infrastructure, some of which isn't there. On the other hand, the vast majority of Americans will do what Chasten and I do, which is we got a hybrid plug-in minivan. We just charge it in the garage, and it does what we need for most purposes. But anyway, the point is to get to that very important question you asked: why, if EVs are coming anyway, why have a policy intervention?
No, they're
Why
being
spend
forced.
taxpayer money?
They're
The answer
being
is
forced.
this.
They're being forced by
No,
government.
nobody's being forced.
CEOs of these corporations don't have a spine. They're all falling in line.
I don't know if you sat down with these CEOs, but I would say they're pretty tough and smart
No, they're
business
scared of Washington, D.C. You know, years ago when the mandate was to have 54.5 mile per gallon average, oh, we can do that by the year 22 or whatever. No way in hell they can hit that before all this electric stuff started happening. It was 25, I think. You know what a 54.5 mile per gallon internal combustion vehicle looks like? It's about this big. Okay, so
Yeah,
nobody wants those. Nobody wants these electric vehicles unless you're an elite that can afford them. People in my district sure as hell don't want them. So keep going. Why are we doing this? Is it over CO2?
Yeah, we're doing it for 3 reasons. Even though the EV revolution is going to happen anyway. I think
It's a
that's
revolution caused
I would
by
love to be able to answer your question, Congressman.
Yeah, okay.
Even though we think that transition is happening in the automotive sector no matter what, there are 3 things that we think are not guaranteed. Will it happen quickly enough to materially help with climate change? Will it happen on equitable terms that are available to people who aren't wealthy and
Okay,
might
I'm
not be
running
able?
short on
and
time,
three-
so let's-
if I could just please finish my answer.
Let's drill
If I
on
could
the climate
just
change.
finish
Let's
the third. Will it be
drill
made
the
on
climate-
American
It's
soil
about
or not?
CO2, isn't it?
How's
what
that?
What percent of the atmosphere is CO2 that we're chasing here?
I'm sorry?
What percent of the atmosphere is CO2 that we're chasing here? Because you talked about climate change.
I don't know the percentage of atmospheric gases.
You don't know the
that consist
percent of the
CO2.
atmosphere.
What I can tell you is that climate change is real. We got to do something about it.
Yeah, this one's
And we've
called
been
autumn, sir. So
I'm sorry?
This one's called autumn right now, so yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't make out what you said, sir.
This climate change right now is called autumn, yes.
Yeah, that's the seasons changing, which respectively is not the same thing as the climate changing. And as somebody who is hoping to retire in the 2050s and who has kids who will be old enough to ask me as they're getting to their 30s whether we did enough to deal with climate change or whether we just did what was convenient, I take that really seriously.
Reclaiming my time, thank you, Mrs. Secretary. The trillions and trillions we're going to cost our kids to chase a tiny percentage of CO2 will bankrupt all of us, and bankrupt our economy, and ship it to China for all the other reasons. So I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman's time has expired.